Okay, planning board, we are live. We are recording. Phone lines are, phone lines will remain off. Go for it.
Good evening and welcome to the Planning Board of the Town of East Hampton's meeting of March 19th, 2025. As you can see, I am zooming in tonight, and my doctor insists that that is for your health and welfare, those of you who are in the room. So I apologize for that. I'll be back at the next meeting. So what we're going to do tonight, we're going to mix the schedule up just a little bit, the agenda that's in front of you. We have 2 sub-waivers and a site plan review, which we're going to review first. We're going to go to the regular meeting subjects and do 2 resolutions from there, and then come back for the Wainscott Commercial Center discussion, which will happen in, I would say, probably 45 minutes or so from now. So that's how we're going to proceed. And very happily, our Vice Chair, Jennifer Fowkes, is willing, able, and ready to jump in and lead the discussion on the first 3 items. I'll leave it to you, Jen.
Thanks, Ed. Feel better, and thank you for considering everybody's health and well-being here. The first matter we have on for the work session is a sub-waiver review of Steiner Oasis, and that is Chris, I believe, is the applicant here. Oh, thank you. Go ahead. Sorry, I can't see you because of the post.
There's a post in the way. All right, good evening. Today will be the first initial review of the subdivision waiver application Steiner Oasis LLC. This is located at 77 Toilsome Lane in East Hampton, and the property is outlined here. The subject parcel is within the B Residence Zoning District and is in Groundwater Management Zone V. Historically, the subject parcel has only been subject to East Hampton Village zoning restrictions, and the existing improvements are indicated on an East Hampton Village certificate of occupancy dated October 3rd, 2008. That's attached to this report. So going on to the application itself. So subdivision waiver application is made to divide the existing parcel into 2 lots along the town border with East Hampton Village. So 1 lot will be entirely within the town and 1 will be entirely in the village. Lot 1 in the village would be 40,642 square feet, and lot 2 in the town would be 25,719 square feet. Both lot sizes conform with the minimum lot area requirements of their respective jurisdictions. For this application, the town will review compliance for lot 2, and East Hampton Village will review lot 1 for its own requirements. The approval from both the town and village planning boards will be required prior to the approval being finalized with the Suffolk County Department of Health Services, and the East Hampton Village Planning Board has completed its initial review of the application, and their planner report is attached. Moving on to the issues of discussion for tonight. For the State Environmental Quality Review Act, the project is an unlisted action pursuant to SECRA and Chapter 128 of the Town Code. The East Hampton Village Planner report suggested that the village assume lead agency status. As an involved agency, the Planning Board would also be a candidate for lead agency. But for an action so minor in scope, the planning department does not recommend it is necessary to object the village serving as lead agent. Alternatively, the planning board could seek lead agency or conduct its own uncoordinated review for the action since it is unlisted. If the village serves as lead, once the coordinated review materials are received, the planning department will review, and if comments are necessary on the short environmental assessment form, they would be sent within 30 days of the date the letter is received. The planning department recommends that it would be acceptable for the village to serve as lead, and the planning board should determine if they agree. Next, moving on to the sub-waiver requirements of town code. The board must consider the town code requirement that it is a policy of the planning board to require reserved areas in all subdivisions, although this requirement may be waived for minor subdivisions. So the planning board should consider if they will waive this requirement in this case, given that the subject parcel is fully cleared, which is considered pre-existing non-conforming to the town regulations since the clearing was permitted in the village. Given such, the planning department does not recommend that the board consider requiring the applicant to revegetate any portion of lot 2, the subject property. The revised submission must also indicate the adjacent landowners per requirement. Moving on to the issues for zoning, the existing improvements on lot 2 are considered pre-existing non-conforming and have been legalized through the mentioned C of O from the village. Given such, the existing garage and walkway along the rear property line will not be required to conform with the pyramid law, setbacks, or the town's limitation of 600 square feet maximum for an accessory structure. The applicant has advised that changes to these structures, if or when proposed, may trigger the need for variances from the Zoning Board of Appeals, and that pre-existing non-conforming structures may only be expanded in accordance with the criteria listed in the sections of code referenced in this report. Regarding the existing swimming pool and patio, these accessory structures appear to comply with the 20-foot required setback from each property line. And per town code, there would be no front yard setbacks since the parcel does not abut any street. Would not abut any street. The applicant has advised the town code prohibits accessory structures and buildings from being constructed on a lot without a principal building or use, unless the lots are contiguous and in common ownership. The applicant should explain if the lots will remain in common ownership, and if common ownership ceases, the applicant is advised that per town code that within 9 months of the change in ownership, either the existing improvements, the swimming pool and garage should be removed, or a building permit shall be made with the building inspector for a principal structure on lot 2. The next issue is regarding the proposed access, which is proposed along a 20-foot wide access easement, which does it conform with the town code, and that easement's shown here in green. So the existing driveway, however, is not located entirely within the proposed access easement and does not comply with the dimensional requirements for common driveways. They must have a minimum improved width of 14 feet with 2 feet cleared on either side. And these dimensions must be provided within the boundaries of the proposed access easement. Also, the driveway is missing an emergency vehicle turnaround at the end of the driveway as required by town code. And the planning department notes the existing stone driveway is approximately 10 feet wide. Given such, the applicant must revise the proposed access easement and driveway configuration to comply with the requirements mentioned in this report. Next issue is regarding utility lines. An existing water supply line for lot 2 is not shown and should be indicated if there's a service line in place for the existing swimming pool. And the submission indicates electric serving lines, existing electrical lines in red from the house going to the existing garage and pool equipment pit. And the planning department recommends that the proposed it's recommended that these service lines be removed and that future service lines would be located within the proposed easement. We recommend that the proposed access easement should be revised to be a proposed access and utility easement, and the planning board should determine if they agree. For the sanitary system, lot 2 does not have any sanitary system. There's no principal building or pool house that would require such system, and any review of the sanitary system on lot 1 will be subject only to the village's review. Regarding drainage and stormwater control, the drainage system for the existing swimming pool should be indicated. Town code requires them to be equipped with dry wells, so the applicant should indicate the existing dry wells and provide their specifications along with the capacity for the swimming pool. Also, per town code, the planning board may require the applicant to provide drainage structures on a common driveway if the improvement disturbs natural water courses or recharge areas or significantly increases runoff to adjacent properties. And we'll note that once a revised driveway plan is submitted, the town consulting engineer will advise on if the applicant should provide drainage structures. The fire marshal findings indicate the proposal is within 1,000 feet of public water and fire hydrants that provide adequate supply for fire protection purposes, and no other reviews needed from that department. Other approvals, the applicants advise that the following additional approvals will be required. Suffolk County Department of Health Services approval for the final subdivision waiver map. The Suffolk County Water Authority approval will be required for connections to existing infrastructure for water services approval to Lot 2, the subject property. And the Suffolk County Planning Commission review is required since the parcel is within 500 feet of State Road and the boundary of the town of East Hampton and East Hampton Village. In conclusion, as another entity being the village intends to serve as the lead agency for SECRA, the board should determine if they agree or if they wish to proceed in another fashion. Until SECRA is completed, a final decision cannot be made. The applicant should submit details on the drainage system for the swimming pool, design details of the common driveway, including the required turnaround, and advise the board regarding whether the lots will remain in common ownership. Lastly, the proposed access easement should be revised to include a compliant driveway and turnaround area, as mentioned, and to include utility service lines, which should be rerouted within the boundaries of the easement. That's all.
Thank you, Chris. Does the applicant wish to be heard? Thanks, Dan.
Hello, Dan Weaver from Walbridge Surveyors on behalf of the applicant. Thank Chris for the memo and for the board for the opportunity to be here. We can address a couple of these things pretty quickly that Chris brought up in the memo. The driveway and drainage plan are in the works. I kind of wanted to get this design before both this board and the village planning board to make sure that, the easement location was, acceptable before we spent the time and the money on the drainage and driveway plan, but that is in the works. We are going to relocate the utilities into the easement, so that's not an issue. There is no water line servicing the pool, so there is no existing water service into what will become, lot 2, the rear portion of the property. So yes, a new water line would have to be run up the easement. It is the intention of the applicant for the lots to remain in common ownership. So, that issue is that's the plan. Obviously that could always change and that could be addressed in the future if necessary. Dry well for the pool, we're gonna have to find that. It's an old pool. So we will locate that dry well and we will get a detail together for that. But as of this point, we don't exactly know where it is because it's been there for quite some time. That's basically all I have, and unless there's any questions from the board.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan. And thanks, Chris, for that. I think this one is my project. So I think it's pretty straightforward. I think it's a strange situation to have one lot that's in both the town and the village. And since both lots meet the minimum lot size requirements for their various jurisdictions, I don't see any major issues with it. Given where it is and the fact that it is totally cleared, I do agree with the planning department that we don't really need to require any open space or reserve area for this particular lot. Dan, I do have one question. I'm sorry, I meant to ask it earlier. Does the applicant plan on building on that second lot anytime soon, even if it's, remains in common ownership?
They're not sure at this point. It's more for estate planning at this purpose to figure out the best use for them for the lot, but they do not have a plan.
Okay.
At this point.
So Tina, you've got, just so I'm clear, if it remains in common ownership, they don't need to file a building permit within the 9 months that Chris stated. Okay. That's kind of all I have. Does anyone have any?
Yeah, I have a question about the reserved area and why shouldn't be mandated just because it's all cleared. Is that in the code?
Good question.
I mean, the reserved area, there's a reason for it. Whether it's cleared now or not, it would be better if it was revegetated.
The reserve area for a sub-waiver is within the board's discretion to waive. For a full subdivision, the code language is stronger. It says shall require a reserve area. For this, it's waivable. Because this lot had approvals, like a CO from another jurisdiction that allowed the clearing, it was our baseline that it didn't need to be required. That doesn't mean that the board can't require it should they deem it appropriate or necessary.
Yeah, I just don't understand why it should not be required, just because it's already cleared. There's a reason why that's in the code. And it doesn't matter whether the property is cleared or not. There's a good reason why it should be reserved, so.
So the way I think of
can't
easements.
find, I
Yeah.
don't know, I can't look at a good reason for me to base my decision on not waiving that requirement.
The way I usually consider an easement is for preservation, right, purposes. And in this case, there is nothing to preserve. You could create some habitat. It would be kind of very targeted in nature. But, if there was like an existing stand of trees here, natural understory, we would probably say, yeah, preserve that. But again, it's up to the board really if they feel it's important.
Would there be a size of an easement that would be suggested by the department?
So for road, for road frontage, it's 10% the depth of the property. And then the reserve area requirements, I don't know them off the top of my head. I know they vary for open space, depending on like an open space subdivision, depending upon the zoning district. I don't remember what they are off the top of my head here.
Okay. Does anyone else? I think it's a really good question, and
Jen, I'd like to chime in on that if I
Oh,
could.
sure. I'm so sorry, Ed. I almost forgot you were there.
How could you? Yeah, I'm very familiar with this property. I used to live right around the corner from it. It's very much a village-like location, right? It's not out in the country. It's sidewalks and curbs and all of that kind of thing. And the way that this property is situated, it's pretty discreet. As you can see, the road frontage on Toilsome Lane is pretty short, and the second lot that will be completely in the town is pretty much invisible from the adjoining street, which is Wireless Road. So and there is actually quite a bit of wooded area behind it as well, as thank you. Yeah, you can see that here. So I'm with Lou on this, that I like to see reserve areas wherever we can have them, but I'm really not seeing in this case where it's viable. Because there really isn't anything natural to be conserved or preserved here, in my view. So that's just my 2 cents.
Thank you. Michael? Nothing?
Nothing.
Bruce?
I agree with Ed. Yeah, I agree with you.
Reed?
I'm fine with it. I support the application.
I agree. I support the application. Okay. If there are no other questions, maybe we'll move on to the questions. No other comments, rather. We can move on to the questions. Does the board agree the proposed work is an unlisted action pursuant to SECRA and agree the village may serve as lead agency?
Yes.
Yes. Will the board waive the requirement for the subdivision waiver to include reserved area? I think we're 6 and 1.
Yes.
Yeah.
Does the board agree the proposed access easement should be revised to a proposed access and utility easement? Yes.
Yes.
Does the board agree a revised minor subdivision map should be submitted that indicates a compliant driveway and turnaround area within the proposed easement?
Yes.
Great. So thank you, everybody. Moving on to the Maram Cabanas ADA ramp is the applicant for this year. Oh, lovely. This is Will, but Tina is covering for Will tonight.
Thanks, Jen. Good evening, board members. This is the site plan for the Maram Pool Cabanas. This application was seen by the board several months ago, and recently in January of 2025 received from the Zoning Board of Appeals an NRSP and variance. The application is for pool cabanas, which would be developed on an already existing pool deck, and it is for 5 of them, and they'll have an area of 72 square feet. Our recommendation is that this application is complete. They have their variance and they were complete before they went to ZBA. We had originally thought this could be a minor site plan due to the small nature of what was being constructed, but because of variance that ends up being required, the code does not permit that to proceed as a minor site plan. So we do have a scheduled public hearing notice for the board should they agree that the application's complete and ready for that.
Okay, thanks, Tina.
Thanks.
Ori, do you have any? So this is kind of a more of a formality than anything else. Can we move right to the singular question?
It's mine.
Oh, I'm so sorry. The power is going to my head.
I have nothing to add.
Do you support this
I
application?
support this application. You ready to do ready for the question?
Ready for the question?
Oh, no other questions?
There's one
There's
question.
one, hit it.
Does the board agree that this application is complete and ready for a public hearing?
Yes.
Yes.
Then in that case, we can schedule a public hearing. For the planning board of the town of East Hampton in the matter of the application of Maram Cabanas site plan SCTM number 300-49-6-26, scheduling a public hearing. Public hearing is hereby scheduled to be held at Town Hall, 159 Pantico Road, East Hampton, on Wednesday, April 23rd at 6:30 p.m. or as soon thereafter as this matter may be heard to consider the said application. I have read this and I move for its adoption.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
You were?
You're learning.
I was told I could do that. Oh, man. I'm gonna
Still
leave.
counts.
Thanks, Lori. Darn it. All right. And then the last, before we move on to Wayne Scott Commercial Center, the last work session is 9 South Fencroft, and I think the applicant is here. And Tina, are you doing this one as
I'm
well?
going to cover as well, yes.
Great. Go for it.
Okay.
I'm all flustered. My
Thank you
phone.
again. This is the application, the Ferncroft subdivision waiver located at 9 South Ferncroft Place in Montauk. The property location is up on the screen and highlighted. This is Westlake Drive and South Ferncroft Place intersection. I'll just zoom out so we see around where we are in Montauk. And the GIS will take a while to load, so I will move to the survey. The application is seeking to create 2 lots, both having road frontage on South Ferncroft. Lot 1 would be 20,000 square feet, and lot 2 would be approximately 27,000 square feet. The site is in the B residence zoning district. Previously, the location contained a single-family home that has since been demolished. Moving on to the issues for discussion. The project is an unlisted action pursuant to SECRA. The applicant should prepare the short EAF, part 1, utilizing the mapper, and once that's acceptable, we recommend the planning board be lead agency. Regarding dimensional conformance, as I mentioned, the site's in the B residence zoning district where the minimum lot area is 20,000 square feet. Both proposed lots currently comply. They also comply with the lot width requirements in the code. Moving on to discuss the sub-waiver requirements. Regarding open space design standards we just talked about, there is the reserve area requirement we spoke of earlier that can or cannot be waived by the board. And there is for sub-waivers specifically a suggestion that the board considered easements totaling not less than 10% of the lot depth and fronting public roads in order to preserve views and habitat. According to section 220-404, the planning board can choose to waive this requirement if they feel it's necessary. The planning board should discuss whether or not they want to require easements here. The land is mostly cleared on lot 1. There are extensions of vegetation along the road frontage on the second proposed lot, and those may be worthy of preservation, but we also want to talk about those in the context of lot access, which I'll get to in a minute. Regarding the building envelopes as shown on the proposed subdivision, you can see they are in the dotted lines here. And these areas shaded in the yellowish color are areas that exceed 20% slopes based on the analysis conducted by the surveyor. In the code, it is prohibited to have the areas with 20% or greater slopes within the building envelope. So we're suggesting that the applicant do some revisions to this in order to avoid those areas, especially where they can around the margins of the site. There are some areas of steep slopes that couldn't really feasibly be removed from the building envelope, it seems. So we're not suggesting that, but I mean, around these areas where the slopes currently project into the building envelope, we suggest that the building envelope be revised to avoid those areas. Regarding access for the lots, no access for the lots was depicted on the survey, and we would like the applicant to discuss their plan for access a little bit. Each lot has road frontage, making this something we wouldn't normally zone in on, but because of the placement of lot 2 and kind of the physical characteristics, we think some thought about this may be prudent. As I just said, there's a lot of steep slopes on the frontage with South Ferncroft, especially on lot 2. And the other thing at play, and you can see it better on the aerial image, I'll just go back to for a second. The intersection here with Westlake Drive is this kind of irregular triangular section. So we are concerned about putting any access closer to that intersection. Not that the applicant has suggested it, but just we're trying to plan an appropriate spot. We think that the site distance there may be challenging. And then there is this triangular shaped intersection. So putting a lot access here may also not be ideal in terms of traffic flow. So we would just like the applicant to talk about their plans for access. Also, in recognition that the steep slopes are there and driveways aren't supposed to exceed a 12% grade. So we suggest that they consider a common driveway with lot 1. Lot 1 does have an easier slope and already cleared area along the frontage of South Ferncroft. And if they don't want to pursue a common driveway and the planning board doesn't think that is necessary, the second option would be for them to propose where they think it's best, and we have the engineer look at it and get their input on safety and grade and those types of things. The other thing I'll mention, it's later in the memo, but I'll just bring it up now. We had asked the applicant for additional information regarding this note here that didn't make. Wasn't very clear, cut easement line per Westlake Drive acquisition map. We weren't sure if this was some kind of burden on the property that may impact the options that they have for access or building envelopes. So we did request that they provide more information on that as well, so we can be sure to consider it with the access discussion. Regarding the water supply and sanitary systems, the proposed subwaivers would be served by public water, and of course, IA systems would be required for both lots. Other agencies involved would include Suffolk County Water Authority and Suffolk County Department of Health Services. So in conclusion, the applicant should submit a short environmental assessment form, adjust the proposed building envelope of lot 2, and clarify the intended access for both lots. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. Would you wish to be heard, Tara?
Good evening, Tara Burke here on behalf of Lighthouse Land Planning, on behalf of the applicant. Thanks, Tina, for going through Bill's memo. Appreciate that. SECRA, we have no problem doing the EAF Part 1. We'll submit that. She can go through your motions after that. The subdivision waiver requirements as far as the open space goes, it's typically been, at least in my experience, the board most commonly waives the requirement for subdivision waivers due to the small lot sizes. This is B residence. It's also as Tina pointed out in several different examples, a tricky intersection. So requiring some sort of reserved area along the front or scenic easement might be problematic. The lot was actually completely cleared in 1952. So some of these slopes, especially the ones in the middle of the envelope, are probably not natural features, but I'll get to that later. But the whole lot is cleared, or at least along the frontage, as is pointed out in the memo. So I'm not so sure what it would accomplish, given the site distance, the small lot sizes with the subdivision waiver option of not including the reserved area there or the scenic easement. As far as the building envelopes go, like I said, the code actually requires that steep slopes that are natural features be excluded from building envelopes, not all steep slopes over 20%. The ones in the middle were previously graded. They're not a natural feature. The ones along the property line in the front on Ferncroft and the ones in the rear could be part of a natural feature. So we'll certainly come back with a revised subdivision map that excludes those slopes. We may need to traverse a small portion of it for access, which I'll get to next, but we're happy to come back with a revised envelope that accomplishes the intent of the code. And then as far as the access goes, we actually didn't submit an access on purpose because we wanted your feedback due to the tricky location. And we will certainly work with an engineer to come up with a common driveway. I know our client would prefer 2 separate driveways. You know, it's a tricky area. So we'll work with an engineer. We'll come back with a common access. We're pretty confident that we can keep it below the 12% slope requirement that's in the code. But ultimately, we'll have to work with an engineer on that and then bring that to you for your review. And then as far as that cut easement goes, we did do quite a bit of research on it. It was from an old 1952 map from the DPW that had to do with that intersection. And they actually took land from one of the neighboring lots. Tina, if you could throw up that aerial, I think that would be helpful for this. Thanks. So they took land from this lot to create this cut here. And that map was never filed. So we sent everything to Charlie. Andy and Charlie have been going back and forth, looking over that. And I think it's resolved, but, you know, let Charlie speak to it.
Yeah, no, I talked with Andy briefly, and I also spoke with Dan Weaver, the surveyor, and he agreed. Basically, it's a map, but it's never been filed on this. So the easement is never actually on record. It doesn't encumber the property. And I think Dan Weaver even said after his review with title companies, he would be willing to, or he will take it off the map because it shouldn't be there.
Right, so we'll come back with a revised map that eliminates that cut easement and also shows a common access that avoids the vast majority of the slopes and keeps it under 12%. And that's it.
Thanks, Tara.
Yeah, there's just a few points that I want to bring up. With regard to the reserved area, the 10% buffer, wouldn't it, in this case, wouldn't it make sense to create that 10% buffer along the road because of the steep slopes? You're not going to build on that anyway. So why not have that easement there?
Well, it would be outside the building envelope, so
Yeah,
we wouldn't put any structures there anyway, you know.
That's what he's saying, right?
Well,
think
what
so.
she's saying is whether you have the easement or not, they're not going to build there anyway.
Okay.
It just,
So
it
why not have
reduces
the
lot area. It really wouldn't accomplish anything here. It's a sub waiver, which it's, at least for my 25 years, been most common practice of the board to waive that requirement for sub waivers in this situation. 1952 or 62 Ariel, it was
When you
all
say it
clear.
wouldn't accomplish anything, what does it usually accomplish that it wouldn't accomplish here? Wouldn't a buffer along that road where, I understand it can't be built anyway.
Right.
Why can't we have it?
I mean, that's up to you to decide, but in my experience, when there's site distance issues, it's usually not something that you want to remain in a natural, like you want to be able to, do something there if you need to, right? I mean, you wouldn't want to impede, I don't know, I'm just thinking if the vegetation goes super high and you can't see around the corner and then you can't do anything with it. It just seems like in that area, I mean, that's for you to decide, but it seems like in that area, it might be an encumbrance that might work against the intent.
Yeah, I don't want to do it. I don't want to push for something that's going to be counterproductive or counter to good planning. But I don't know. I can't think of any good reason why not to have that easement. I don't know if you've given me any. And, I'll leave it up to the other board members to discuss
Yeah,
it.
we're happy to speak to our client about it, but I do think, I do think that we have to figure out the access as well.
Yeah, no,
So,
that was my, I think
they go hand in hand.
the access cannot be in lot one, the one closest to Westlake Drive, because of the steep slopes. So I think you need a common driveway that starts at the other end of the lot two. What do you think?
You mean lot one is?
Lot one's up on the other side.
Yeah.
So Andy Hammer, I'm also here with Tara. Two things on the common driveway. I wouldn't want to have a common driveway that enters all the way on the, I guess that's the north on that map, and have them drive by another house to get into it. We're going to try and get it as close as we can to the common boundary lot. And I think we can do that and maintain a 12% slope. That's kind of one of the reasons, scenic easements typically protect natural areas. Nothing in this area is natural. It's not natural vegetation. Whatever is there is grown up from a lack of mowing, I guess, and those slopes may or may not be natural, but I suspect even if you look at the aerial, this area was regraded. It's been improved since 1962 or thereabouts. So there's no natural community that we're protecting by putting a scenic easement there. What you would want is a buffer between this and the road. I just don't know if this is a great location for that because of the site distances. You're kind of on a corner. You're going to be shielding a driveway that may or may not, where it comes out, you're going to not reduce their site distance to the right or to the left by about 20 feet if it's the width. That might be more of a safety issue than it would, if this were a natural area and it was vegetated and had natural, that undisturbed areas, I think it would make more sense. This one, I just think if I were coming out of a driveway there and I had 20-foot scenic easements on either side that were going to grow up, it might actually reduce my ability to safely make that turn out onto the road. So that's why I would suggest this isn't a great location for that. There might be other areas we could look to, provide buffers that would make more sense, but along the road frontage is probably one of the more difficult ones.
To point out there's a lot going on in this section. This is the clearing line here. So this is all cleared at present. This is a telephone pole, and there's more telephone poles that all go through here with electric service.
So there's, utilities within that area.
If I could just interject, I think it'd be important for us to see what the access plan is, have our engineer look at it and give us their opinion on whether or not there are
It's all
site
intertwined.
distance. It's really intertwined. That's why we weren't too strident on it either here. The access being safe and compliant is number one. And then we're, depending on where that is, maybe we pick this up and say, okay, does something make sense now?
No, I agree totally. I think we still need to look at the other elements of what's going to happen with both lots before we decide on the buffer. I'm not that strongly feeling that it's got to be the buffer there, but yeah, I think we need to look at all the elements that.
And if we do want to make sure that the areas of natural slopes or steep slopes, if we don't know that they're natural, don't get disturbed, an easement would be a good way to do it, right? So if at the end of the day, they don't have to be disturbed and they're not in the building envelope, it might be a no harm, no foul, right? You're not going to disturb them anyway. We want to make sure that happens and they get preserved in that way. But I think let's see how it shakes out before we.
Yeah, let's look at a comprehensive plan. That's all I have.
Does anybody else have any comments? I also agree. We should kind of wait and see. Thank you, Tara. Thank you, Andy.
Sure.
Tina. Thank you, Lou. Should we move on to the questions? Okay. Does the board agree that this work is an unlisted action pursuant to SECRA? Yes.
Yes.
Does the planning board wish to request scenic easements along the roadway? I think we just discussed that, and that's a TBD.
Yep, TBD.
Should the applicant modify the building envelope of Lot 2 to avoid areas of steep slopes? Yes. I say yes. And Tara, just to clarify, I think we're not talking about those two little ones in the center, right, Tina?
Yeah.
Just the stuff that kind of is on the road.
Yeah, no problem.
So that's a yes. Should the applicant submit revised plans depicting the access points for the proposed lots? Yes. Should the applicant submit the requested information about the existing easement on the property? I think we satisfied that.
Great.
Thank you, guys. Just before we move on to Wainscott Commercial Center, we have a sub-waiver resolution. That's yours. Do you read it? You read it. See, I'm learning. Sorry, Michael.
In the matter of the application of Sidorak and Decker subdivision waiver, Suffolk County Tax Map number 300-32-4-22.1, 22.2. I have read the resolution amending approval and I move forward.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so that's all of us. And then the last extension of time is for Iconic Land Trust. Michael, would you like to?
Sure, oh my goodness. In the matter of application of the Iconic Land Trust, request for extension of time. 1 year increments within which to obtain a certificate of occupancy or until December 4, 2025. I've read the resolution. I've read the extension of time. And I move for its adoption.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
All right.
Jen, I'm going to have to abstain from that vote.
Right. Thank you, everybody. I am now going to recuse myself from the next discussion and turn it back to Ed.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Jen. A moment to organize. So Tina, do we have Peter and Dan with us? And is the applicant in the room?
If you give, excuse me, just 1 second. If you give everybody some time on Zoom, they're just clicking in now.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, so they told me they're joining. We have one member of the applicant's team and, hello? And we do not have the other yet. So let's give a minute while we all get collected. Are you sure? Okay.
Is it Mr. Tinsel or, since I can't see the room, Mr. Tinsel or Mr. Egan who's there?
Mr. Tinsel is here.
Okay, great. Welcome.
He said thank you. Okay. So we also just had our key members of our consultant team join us. Dan Rousseau from White, Osterman and Hannah, Secret Council, and Peter Varro and Gwen Sferici from AKRF who are working with us on the EIS. Peter is going to put up the presentation and I will get started. I guess I'll stand up since he's going to work the presentation for me. So this is the application for the Wayne Scott Commercial Center preliminary subdivision. And the objectives of the presentation for tonight are summarized here. Peter and I are going to split this presentation up. I'm going to review with the board our recommendations for why a supplemental draft EIS have been made and why it's required in this instance. And then Peter is going to walk through the scope of technical analysis that we are recommending is necessary in the supplemental DEIS. To provide a just really brief intro to that, a key objective of our discussion today is to describe why we're recommending the EIS is required and present the contents. The scope that we're talking through with you tonight represents the culmination of a series of discussions with the applicant, town staff, and each party's team of consultants and attorneys. The draft scope has been targeted at issues where the planning department recommends new analyses are needed in order to fulfill seeker obligations and compliant with the seeker criteria for when supplemental EISs are necessary. It has been informed by public comments and involved agency comments, and they're incorporated as necessary per the seeker regs. It should also be noted that the draft supplemental scope does not include discussion of all items. It doesn't include discussion of all the substantive or technical comments on the draft EIS that will eventually be discussed in the final EIS. Those are not forgotten. They will be discussed when we get there. If the planning board agrees with our recommendation, seeker requires that the board adopt a positive declaration and scope for the draft supplemental EIS. And we've prepared a draft combined POSDEC and SDIS scope for your adoption this evening. So now, a summary of our current status with respect to the environmental review. For actions where an EIS has been prepared, seeker requires that a statement of findings is issued and that the statement set forth the decision that the board makes and the conditions upon which it is based. In April 2023, the planning department issued comments where we noted that we did not recommend the planning board could issue a statement of findings that was compliant with what seeker requires based on the analyses contained in the draft EIS. We've copied the seeker language onto this slide. Seeker requires that the lead agency certify, and I won't read the whole thing, but I'll just emphasize that last underlined part, that you certify that adverse environmental impacts will be avoided or minimized to the maximum extent practicable by incorporating as conditions of the decision those mitigation measures that were identified as practicable. Our observations in April 2023 were that in order to comply with these requirements, additional technical analysis was required. We noted that due to the state of certain analyses in the EIS, as well as changes to circumstances related to the application, the supplemental EIS was recommended. As we reviewed in January when we spoke with all of you about this project, subsequent to that memo, the applicant made several unrequested submissions to address the comments. And we had a dialogue with them to work through their submissions, even though they were not requested, and this took a significant amount of time. At this point, we've developed a targeted supplemental scope that focuses on key technical analyses still outstanding for the board's review. Before I leave this slide, I'll just remind us all that often the bottom line in seeker is summarized as you're required to take a hard look at the relevant environmental impacts and identify mitigation related to those impacts. And that responsibility is a key principle guiding us as we continue to move through this application. And we think the supplemental EIS is necessary in order to achieve that bar. On the next slide, I'm going to just focus a little bit on the supplemental EIS itself. This is a very important issue. Seeker has a narrow set of circumstances where a supplemental EIS is appropriate. And they're listed here. These are taken from the Seeker law directly. It's when there is a change to the project, there's newly discovered information, or changes in circumstances occur, and they are related to specific significant environmental impacts, not addressed or inadequately addressed in the draft. The decision on whether to proceed with the supplemental is a really critical one and must be linked to the importance of the information and the present state of the analysis in the EIS related to those factors. The information that we've ascertained is missing from the DEIS is of critical importance to determining whether significant adverse impacts will occur, and if so, how they can be appropriately mitigated. And they relate directly to the Seeker categories that allow a supplemental EIS to be required. On the next slide, I'll talk about the procedural elements of a supplemental EIS. For cases where a supplement is required, it's subject to the same procedural requirements of the draft EIS, including scoping, preparation of the draft, completeness review, and public comment, and then responses to public comments received in the form of a final EIS. We're going to follow all of those procedural steps here. With respect to the first step, which is scoping, the Seeker law exempts a supplemental EIS from public scoping, and we're not recommending that public scoping be required in this case. I understand that the board's typical practice is to invite public comment, especially when matters could be controversial, as this application certainly has been. And in most cases, that makes perfect sense. However, in this case, we make this recommendation that it's not advised because the board has already received a significant amount of public comment. As I stated when I started, the supplemental scope has been developed by incorporating comments from the public and involves agencies, along with the technical review of our consultants, the planning department as well. And all that has been combined to result in the, as well as a review of the analyses that the applicant submitted after the draft DIS. And all of that has resulted in the supplemental scope you see before you now that addresses the gaps in the record related to the Seeker criteria for when an SEIS is warranted. And because the comments have already been received and incorporating, repeating public comment would not be advantageous in our opinion. I am going to note that since the scope issuance, which was February 28th when we issued the draft scope, we have received some public comment. Some of the technical comments we received were submitted last year, and those were considered in the formulation of the scope, where they were related to the areas the supplemental EIS is going to cover. Thus, our proposed analyses are not conflicting or missing out on these types of inputs. One area where the public comments are not fully aligned with our approach is with respect to the Hamlet Plan alternative, which public comments are encouraging the board to continue to emphasize. We received 2 public comments specifically requesting that the Hamlet Plan be emphasized. So here I'm going to pause a little bit and speak about the Hamlet Plan. The comprehensive plan map that was the Hamlet Plan is a concept plan that considers a mixed-use zoning and public park and is a concept that was never implemented into the town's zoning code. The Hamlet Plan alternative that is in the EIS is not the same as what was in the comprehensive plan. The EIS Hamlet Plan identifies lots that are offered for public purchase, like public use, park, what have you, within 5 years of approval of the subdivision. Though comments were made by the planning board and the planning department to the applicant to make the EIS alternative more consistent with the Hamlet Plan, many times throughout the draft EIS process, that was not done. But the EIS was accepted for public comment to move the process forward. It's critical to remember a few things, just noting what I just said. First, the EIS Hamlet Plan alternative would not compel the lots that are offered for public purchase to actually be purchased. You can't compel an action from another party as part of a secret decision. But the second thing that's very important to notice too is that we are also going to be discussing all substantive public comment in the final EIS stage. So we're pausing for the supplemental scope for the things that we're saying are deficient that meet the secret criteria. That doesn't mean we're not going to continue to discuss these other substantive issues that have been raised within the context of the final EIS. But what we are saying is that we don't think that's an appropriate focus for the supplemental EIS that we're proposing to you this evening. Next, and as Peter will discuss more later, the scope does require that the subdivision map or alternatives continue to be improved in meaningful ways that are compliant with town code. These are the things Peter will discuss later. They're with respect to things like stormwater, buffers, existing uses, wastewater treatment, and other matters. The scope requires development of a plan that's more consistent with the planned industrial park special permit requirements. As you all recall, the identification of the planned industrial park special permit was a change of circumstance after the draft EIS was accepted a few years ago. Subsequently, the ZBA ruled that the planned industrial park permit was required, which did change the regulatory framework that's applicable to the project. And so that special permit criteria and how it relates to the proposal was never assessed, and we are going to be asking that it be assessed now. And addressing the special permit criteria could enhance the compatibility of the park with the surrounding area. And Peter will discuss more about that later. Finally, I'll note that the scope we developed is targeted and specific. During the supplemental DEIS completeness review phase, we will be analyzing the submissions very carefully to be sure that all that has been requested is provided in a thorough and complete manner. Once the applicant fully submits what's required, the draft supplemental EIS will be subject to public comment, and all public comments, again, both those from the original draft EIS and the supplemental draft EIS, will be responded to in the final EIS. Finally, just to, on the next slide, conclude the introductory comments I'm making, I'm gonna pass it on to Peter to bring you through the technical details, but first, this first bullet kind of goes back to where I started. Our recommendation is that we cannot comply with the substantive requirements of SECRA and produce findings that will achieve the goal that certifies that the action is one that avoids or minimizes adverse impacts to the maximum extent practical, and that adverse impacts will be avoided or minimized by incorporating conditions of the decision of those mitigation measures which are identified as practical. The additional work we're proposing to undertake has to do first. Ultimately, it's the board's decision, and we'll now talk through the details. Thank you. Peter?
Thanks, Tina. So as Tina said, we are, the planning department is recommending that the board consider two actions tonight. The first is to require that a supplemental DEIS be prepared. That would be the adoption of what's known as a positive declaration, or POSDEC in SECRA terms. And the second action is to adopt a scope for that supplemental DEIS, which is basically the outline of the required contents for that supplemental. Both documents have been combined, so there's one single PDF, and both there's a resolution in front of you that would allow adoption of both of those actions. So starting off with, I'm going to run through the document briefly. If you have questions, please feel free to ask. So starting off with the first part of what is before you, which is the positive declaration of why an SDEIS is required. So going back to those criteria that Tina spoke about, there were certain changes in circumstances related to the application that directly impact and implicate the potential for one or more significant adverse impacts. And one of the largest changes in circumstances is the ZBA decision that the subdivision itself is a planned industrial park special permit use. as required by that special permit. It requires a, quote, overall plan for the use, which incorporates adequate and suitable designs for infrastructure, off-street parking, access, drainage, landscape, buffers, and screens. The original subdivision application was not designed with the benefit of needing to comply with those criteria. So it's very likely that some project changes would be required. In addition, as Tina mentioned, there is new information that has been provided, as well as new information that is required, that again directly implicate the potential for significant adverse impacts. One area is that some of the existing uses on the site don't currently have certificates of occupancy. They may lack site plan, other required approvals. Prior uses on the site were not necessarily described in the EIS, such that may impact areas such as stormwater and site contamination. With respect to stormwater, there's a need to provide a stormwater pollution prevention plan that demonstrates compliance with the New York State DEC general permit, as well as an analysis of a positive drainage system on the site. With respect to traffic, a new traffic study was presented to the board by the applicant subsequent to the DEIS in 2023. Subsequent to that, there were actually additional traffic counts that were taken. So that is new information to consider as well. And then with respect to subsurface contamination, the Suffolk County Health Department identified the need based on the analysis in the DEIS for further site characterization. The planning department and others have identified the potential for prior and existing uses to have the potential to lead to contamination on the site, and that potential was not adequately addressed in the DEIS. With respect to wastewater and nitrogen loading, the analysis of the potential for a sewage treatment plant, again, was not adequately addressed in the DEIS. The noise analysis was not adequate in the DEIS, and the need for a clustering alternative that is more consistent with the comprehensive and hamlet plans, as well as now the planned industrial park special permit, it was noted as being needed in the DEIS. So for those reasons, we are recommending to the board that they require a supplemental DEIS and that the scope of that DEIS be limited to these areas. As Tina said, the other environmental areas that were the subject of the DEIS and much agency and public comment still need to be addressed in the final EIS. However, they don't rise to the level of requiring additional analysis in a supplemental. So the issues that are up here that you see before you will be addressed in the final EIS. Comments will still need to be addressed and the board will still need to make findings. But we really wanted to have a targeted EIS that is the requirement of seeker. So that is the why we are requesting and recommending that you issue a positive declaration. And then the what is, what are we recommending be required? And the scope that was published on the website and distributed to the board at the end of February lists the contents that we are proposing for the supplemental EIS, and they are limited to those topic areas. So instead of putting up slides that repeat verbatim the text in the proposed scope, I'm going to run through some of the highlights. So if you're following along on page 7, it begins with a description of the project. And really there are two components of the project that we refer to throughout the scope. The first is the subdivision or planned industrial park. And we need to kind of have a full understanding of that, as well as what modifications are required to that subdivision. Those are listed in attachment A. And then how that subdivision conforms with the requirements for the planned industrial park. And in attachment B to the scope, we described certain modifications to the subdivision that should be considered and incorporated into the subdivision that we believe are more consistent with the special permit criteria. And to the extent that
Excuse me one
one or more
second,
of
Pete.
those
Pete, this
items
is
are
LTV.
not-
Pete,
Yes.
this is LTV. You stopped sharing your screen. Is that on purpose?
Yes, it was. I have no
Okay.
more slides. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Go on,
No,
please.
thank you. To the extent that one or more of those recommendations are not able to be incorporated into the subdivision, the EIS requires that they be considered, that they be analyzed, that there be a discussion of them. And that's especially true with respect to the concept of clustering in the design of the 50 lots or 48 new lots, so to speak. And then the second part of the project really has to do with the site plans for the existing uses proposed to remain on the southern, say, third of the site or quarter of the site. Those uses do need to have a site plan approval, and we need to understand what's on the sites now, what's being removed, what's being added, where the access are, how each of them are complying with screening and all the other criteria that are applicable to site plans. Moving, and then I guess at the end of that first project description chapter, right, a list of all of the approvals that are required, and we understand them pretty well for the most part on the planned industrial park. On the site plan side, less information was available in the DEIS, so we're looking for more of that information in the SEIS. Moving on to stormwater. Again, we broke this down into a section related to the subdivision, the planned industrial park first, and then the site plan for the existing uses. So with respect to the subdivision, the scope requires that a preliminary SWIP be prepared consistent with state and town standards, that maintenance for the systems be described. And one of the items that is in here is the town's engineer, the planning department, has continued to advise the applicant that they believe a positive drainage system is required for this site. And that positive drainage system is subject to a different design standard in the town code. And the EIS needs to analyze those different systems. Again, the town engineer and planning department say that the positive drainage system is required. The applicant has disagreed with that. What we need in the EIS at bare minimum is a comparison of those two systems so that we can understand, the board can understand the environmental impacts of one system versus another. So separate from code compliance, we need to look at the environmental impacts of that. When we get to the site plan for the existing uses to remain, again, this is simply, we need to understand what the stormwater management systems are proposed to be for those site plans and how those stormwater management systems comply with the required state and town regulations. Moving on to traffic. As we said, there was a new traffic study that was provided in 2023. The planning department and planning board's consultants have reviewed that, provided comments last spring to the applicant. That's been discussed several times. So we're recommending that new traffic study, which incorporated some of the comments and recommendations that the department, your traffic consultant, the public had on the original traffic impact study in the DEIS. That can serve as the base, this 2023 traffic study, and be updated to reflect the comments from your planning consultant, as well as a few specific items that are mentioned in the scope and kind of highlighted, which have to do with the calibration and validation of the synchro models, and analysis of different trip generation factors, the potential for diversions, cut throughs, et cetera. None of this is necessarily kind of new information that is being requested. We just need to kind of continue to follow up and kind of get all of it into one place and consider it holistically, as well as kind of, understand the implications of this new analysis. With respect to subsurface contamination, the applicant did prepare what was called a white paper back in the summer of 24 that did cover some of this additional information that was requested, though other pieces of this information were not in that white paper. But basically what we're recommending is that this chapter of the SEIS kind of goes soup to nuts on this issue, starting with a very detailed site history from before the site operated as a mine through its time as a mine, the other uses that were on the site, have been on the site, are currently on the site, and understand what those uses are and what the potential for those uses to have resulted in subsurface contamination would be. We then want to move on and understand the investigations that have already happened on the site in a little more holistic way. So there have been obviously subsurface testing over many different testing periods and times for different purposes, by different, overseen by different entities. And we need to understand, kind of look at them all together, what has been tested, what parameters, where on the site, what methodologies, and compare them all to present day standards so that we can, again, understand what really is known throughout the site, and moving towards a more holistic look of potential issues that are on the site. We know that the DEC obviously went out, did an investigation, made a determination with respect to a certain program that they administer. The planning board obviously has a different standard and different role. And so we need to understand what the impacts of the proposed project are. When we're talking about subsurface contamination here, we're talking about the movement of 50 acres of material around the site and the regrading. That's not something that's contemplated by the DEC standards and the DEC program that had already evaluated the site. So you have the authority and responsibility to take a look at what the impacts are with respect to this action. And that's why we're seeking this additional information. And then from there, we have this more fulsome picture of what is known on the site, what's unknown, and we can, we've requested and required that applicable mitigation measures be developed based on what we know and what we don't know. So again, I think it's relatively straightforward, though it is quite fulsome and complete in terms of what it is requesting. With respect to wastewater, groundwater, nitrogen, I'm now on page 18. The applicant did submit, again, a white paper on this issue. Some of this information that's requested was in that white paper and obviously just should be ported over. Some is some new information that is being requested. We need to get some of the modeling assumptions that were in the DEIS corrected. We need to compare the assumptions from these models to other sources, such as the Suffolk County Subwatershed Plan. We need to take a good look at the EIS, rather, needs to take a good look at the potential for a sewage treatment plant to be constructed and operated on this site to serve this project. That is a potential mitigation measure that may or may not be feasible on this site, and may or may not be appropriate. And the supplemental needs to, pardon the pun, flush that out a little bit more. We also need additional information on the models that were used to determine the nitrate transport and potential nitrate loading to Georgia Pond. We've identified and discussed with the applicant several kind of critical assumptions and data points that this supplemental needs to hone in on. And from there, once we get that information and understand the potential for the nitrogen loading to Georgia Pond, then we can, and the supplemental needs to, analyze the potential water quality and ecological impacts. So first, we need to make sure the data, we're confident in the data, the assumptions, the results, and then the actual impact analysis. With respect to noise, the original DEIS did not have much of an analysis on the potential impacts of noise. The applicant had agreed to and actually has performed a noise study, the scope of which was coordinated with the planning department and its technical consultants. And it includes new noise measurements, an analysis of operational impacts, traffic impacts, and construction level noise impacts. And the applicant, again, has provided that noise analysis. We have made, as the planning board's consultant, some technical comments on that analysis to advance the completion of that chapter and that analysis in the EIS. So those are the main sections of the EIS that we are recommending to the board. Happy to answer any questions or go into more detail or stop droning on from a TV screen in the meeting room, which I appreciate the courtesy of being on. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Peter. Thanks very much, Tina, for a thorough but not too detailed overview of where it is that we are and what you're proposing as a scope for an SDEIS. So before we have our discussion as a board, Mr. Tintle, would you like to be heard?
Good evening, planning board. Good evening, Tina, Peter, Ed. John Tintle, the applicant. So a couple things. This whole process has taken 2 years. It's been well discussed. We have reviewed the scope and have no problems with the scope, but I'd like to provide a little of my perspective. So we spent 5 years developing the DEIS that was deemed complete over 2 years ago. And the circumstance that brings us to the supplemental is the planned industrial park, which has existed in the code for decades. There have been several CI subdivisions that have gone before this board, and it's never been required. And the first thing I did when it was suggested was look at the application for a planned industrial park and tried to fill it out. The answer would be NA, not applicable to most of the questions, because a planned industrial park imagines the future uses as if I was going to be planning buildings and uses along with this subdivision. I implore the board to look at this application and attempt to fill it out. Now, there's nothing in that application, there's nothing in the planned industrial park that we can't comply with or align with this subdivision. But there's also nothing in there that triggers all of this additional review. Now, we're going to do this additional review. We've actually completed a lot of the work over the past 2 years. And with that, it has been a lot of time. We've gone over this scope through the last year and a half that led to the meetings that we had in the spring. In that last meeting, I was assured that I would have this scope in September. Here we are 6 months later. In those meetings, we did speak about the planned industrial park concept and the concept of clustering. And now Peter has mentioned the word several times, and I've tried to get it out of him of what they mean by clustering, because I'm sure the board has a clear idea of what clustering is when that word is used in the subdivision. And in that context, you're creating open space. You're making your lots smaller. You're keeping the same yield, but shrinking the size of the lots and creating open space. So the memo that we received after the close of comments, after the DEIS was deemed complete and we had a public hearing, came in the spring of 2023. Weeks later, and much of that discussed this clustering. On and on and on about clustering. Weeks later, our same planning department put this out about the Springs corridor and the Bistrian mine. They've gone on about discussing the desire that they would have to create open subdivision in that subdivision. And now I'm going to read directly from it. Although benefits could accrue from allowing open space subdivisions on CI zoned properties, they are not permitted. With little flexibility, the regulations for the subdivision of CI zone land results in a grid style development surrounded by a thin strip of open space meeting the minimum 10% open space requirements. That is what you have before you. They keep measuring clustering. It's a buzzword that they cannot articulate. In the last meeting that we had together, I begged Peter to tell me what he meant by clustering, and he just merely kept repeating the words. So we will work diligently on this supplemental and hope to provide all the information that's requested. But we also hope that this process can move along at a swifter pace. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate those comments. And I want to assure you, Mr. Kendall, that this board is also very anxious to move this project along. I thank you, by the way, for also offering us all tours of the site so that we could actually get our eyes on what is on what the site actually looks like, to get our eyeballs on it from the inside. That was very helpful. So thank you for cooperating on that. And thank you very much for your willingness to, to continue on and do the work that's called for in the supplemental review. I will point out one thing, and that is that the acceptance of the DEIS back in 2023 was acceptance for completeness. It was really not accepting it in terms of substance, but it was accepting it for completeness for purposes of moving things forward to a public hearing. So, much of what's being requested here has been requested before. I do think that the scope of this supplemental is actually very focused and very targeted, and hopefully we can work together. Your questions about clustering can be answered, that we can work together with the planning department and our consultants to get to the right answers. I thank you for your patience and appreciate your working through this with us. So I'll ask the board if there are any other comments or thoughts about where we go from here and whether or not we need to require an SDEIS and whether this is the one. Any comments or thoughts about anything that's been said in Peter and Tina's presentation or Mr. Tintle's?
I'll kick it off. I appreciate what Mr. Tintle had to say, and I sympathize with his frustration. Certainly, if I was in his shoes, I would not enjoy all the time that it's taking. And however, having said that, this project is not just like any other application that comes in front of us. This is a huge monumental project. And by using those words, I don't mean the size necessarily, the 50 unit, 50 lots and 70 acres. I mean, how it will transform a key area of the town in terms of environmental impact, noise, traffic, subsurface contamination. We need to find out more about what's going on there. So there is a lot. And I think the public, the citizens of East Hampton want us to do a thorough job in estimating what this will mean for the town. So I think we would be remiss if we didn't dot every I and cross every T. And I think that's what we're trying to do. And we have professionals looking at it. Certainly, I will do my best to be fair and judge what's in front of us. But my plan is to adhere to make sure that we make our decisions with good planning in mind and for the citizens of East Hampton. And that means, Mr. Tintle as well. So I want to do this in a fair way so that we can move forward in a rapid pace, but a thorough pace. So those are my comments.
Thanks, Lou. Anyone else have a comment before we go to a vote?
No, I agree with what Lou just said. I think our supplemental requirements are pretty focused, and it's items that we typically require anyway. So, yeah, I'm in favor.
Yeah, I do not feel that the requests or the composition of the supplemental is unreasonable.
Okay.
I also agree with the other board members. And I wanted to echo what Ed had said earlier. Mr. Tintle, it's very kind of you to show us the property. I'd never been back there before. It's not an everyday occurrence. You see 70 contiguous acres owned by a family here. And I know it's been your family a long time. And I do support your right to repurpose that land for another use. I heard your comments, not just this evening, but last time. I get the impression you're fine with the scoping. You just don't think it's fair. That's basically the impression I had this evening. But I will say it is a very complex application. There are some serious environmental concerns. And I think that this is the appropriate way to go with no corner cutting. So.
Yeah, I agree with the board, and Lou, I think you articulated it perfectly. We have a duty to the town, our constituents of the town of East Hampton, and to you, Mr. Tintle, as well. I think this scope is extremely detailed, and we're moving forward. I think this is the way to move ahead, which I know has been obviously a major frustration for you. And I think we have the board in place to facilitate that and do the right thing.
Okay, thank you, board. So we'll actually take two different votes. The first, do we want to adopt a positive declaration and require an SDIS first? And then we'll vote on whether this is the scope we want to adopt. So let's go around the table. Do we want to adopt a POSDEC and require a supplemental DEIS? We'll start with you, Reed.
I think that was the decision, yes.
Bruce.
I'm supporting that. Yeah.
Yes.
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 Okay. And then secondarily, do we adopt the scope that's been outlined in the documents that were presented by the planning board and our consultants and addressed tonight? Reed?
Yes.
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 Okay. Unanimous in both cases.
Ed, this is Dan. The board had before it a draft resolution that incorporates those sentiments.
Yes.
And just thought it appropriate that you cite to that and.
Yes,
make sure
yes.
the board is-
I will absolutely do that next, Dan. Thank you. But I wanted to, get an actual vote on those two questions from the board. So we'll go to the resolution which you have in front of you in the matter of the application of Wainscott Commercial Center preliminary subdivision, Suffolk County Tax Map 300-192-2-6.2 to 6.7, issuance of a positive declaration and scope for its supplemental draft environmental impact statement. I will just make a note that the resolution itself is quite lengthy and goes into the entire history of the project and indicates in some detail what it is that we'll be addressing, which we've already discussed tonight. So the resolution of a planning board of the town of East Hampton issuing a positive declaration and scope for a supplemental draft environmental impact statement for the preliminary subdivision application entitled Wainscott Commercial Center. I have read this resolution and I call for its adoption. Second? Okay, thanks, Lou. All in favor of adoption?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Unanimous all around, passed and carried. Thank you very much. And we'll note that there's one recusal and that Jen is recused from the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Well, wait a minute. Are we going to do the minutes?
Yeah, all right. We didn't do the minutes earlier when Jen was right. Okay. I assume everyone has read the minutes. Are there any comments, corrections?
No. Look good to me.
Okay, then a motion to adopt the minutes of March 5th.
So move.
Okay, and a second? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, pass and carry. All right, I think that's a wrap. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Kinzel.
Who's going to do it?
And we will carry on from here. Motion to, Bruce.
I'll make that motion.
Okay.
Second.
All right, all in favor? I think you're all.
Aye.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks. Have a good evening, everyone.